Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Allow me to start by thanking the Botswana Stock Exchange for inviting me to participate in this very important inaugural International Listings Conference. My sincere hope and prayer is that the beginning and end is not in the organizing and hosting of this conference, but that this should only mark the beginning of a journey to result in more issuers listing on not only the BSE, but also on other African stock markets overall. But I think I should also say here that the next step should be a conference of this nature in London, or New York, or Beijing, or Tokyo, for reasons that I'm sure you appreciate. Let me put it out to you at the outset that in achieving this objective, the role of good or sound corporate governance cannot be overemphasized. And on that score, I see that I've been actually given to talk about what can be two very broad topics, but given time limitations, I'll concentrate more on the first and make only commentary remarks on the second. Okay. I have used this content deliberately, first of all, to give a very broad context of the ecosystem of capital markets, and then using that to look at challenges of corporate governance in terms of, on the one hand, capital inflow into the capital markets, on the other hand, capital deployment from the capital markets. I also then give challenges of the market systems and structures from a corporate governance point of view, and then make recommendations for the way forward. I just very briefly touch on the issue of sustainability. So I'm going to mostly use this slide especially for the time limitation that we have, to talk about the context of corporate governance. If you see on the left-hand side there, you have funds inflow into capital markets. And on the right-hand side, you have the funds deployment. And funds come from many different sources, as you can see, but each of these has its own corporate governance challenges. Foreign investors, for instance. And foreign investors come in different categories. Earlier, we heard about FDI, foreign direct investment. That's one form of foreign funds, although not necessarily into capital markets. And my particular and personal view about FDI is that it's opaque sometimes, that asset pricing is subjective, and for all the volumes of FDI that flow into Africa, it's debatable how much impact they have on the economy. So the kind of foreign investment that we should be looking for is more the portfolio investments, foreign portfolio investments. Why? From a corporate governance point of view, they are coming from funds that have very high standards for corporate governance and want to insist on those standards being deployed, being applicable in the markets where they're investing here in Africa. And so even at the outset in their due diligence, they are going to want to see high standards of corporate governance. Okay? When they are shareholders, when they come in through direct investment, not through nominee structures, they are going to hold the counters in which they invest to high standards of corporate governance. So they present that challenge for us. You then have local institutions. And Mrs. Molefe here represents one of those local institutions. They have interesting corporate governance challenges. Certainly across Africa, we do know that they sit on a lot of excess cash, which is not invested in assets that would give them returns that they're looking for their holders of those investments. Part of the reason is that the corporate governance processes within these institutions are challenged. Challenged to the extent that they would not necessarily invest because they will get a decent return. They may invest for other, maybe even political considerations. We have cases in the country where I come from where funds are deployed to entities at a price that's not market related, not market determined, and certainly don't get a decent return for their holders of investments in these funds. You then have the diaspora. I want to put it to you that the diaspora is a huge untapped potential for African capital markets. Except a person in diaspora has been ripped off, not once, not twice, many times. Why? Because avenues for investing into overall continent are not there, but particularly even for capital markets, some of the advisors have taken advantage of the absentee nature of the diaspora and ripped them off. Then you have the public. I want to put it to you that the public, in many ways, lack requisite information. We heard the question earlier on regarding this. They lack requisite information regarding the role capital markets can play in their businesses and even in their own lives. We have low domestic savings in some of these markets, so mobilizing public funds is a challenge. We also have instances where financial education is very low, and therefore it's difficult to tap into public sources. That is a challenge from a corporate governance point of view, obviously lack of appropriate knowledge. Then if you look on the right-hand side, the funds deployment part of it, you have debt, you have equities, you have other structures. Now, it's important to understand that listing is not just about equity. You can issue a bond and get that listed also. Hence, looking at this in this structure. Now, in terms of debt, what I haven't heard this morning is the role of capital markets debt, for instance, in infrastructure funding. The example of the Botswana telecoms coming to the market is a great example of a utility listing. We don't see a lot of that across Africa. I want to say that partly why these entities don't use capital markets to benefit from capital markets is poor corporate governance within the entities themselves. Because if they came to the market, they are going to be held to levels of corporate governance they don't want to be exposed to. In particular, I want to say that the structure of boards and how the boards work in these entities is a big challenge. I hope this thing can go back. Let me try to jump to a slide here that looks very innocuous at the outset, but has huge implications from a corporate governance point of view. This picture is not as innocent and innocuous as it might appear. Board chairpersons who are often meant to be non-executive end up living, not working, living in the entities of which they are chairpersons of those boards. And each time they spend a day at a corporation where they are chairs of the board, they demand to be paid sitting allowance. Because after all, they've been sitting, right? And there are many in our markets traumatized chief executives, traumatized by tyrannical chairpersons. I'm sure Ms. Vaca is not one of these. So the BSE CEO is safe. Why? It's even alleged that some ministers get fired because they disagree with a board chairperson. This is a huge challenge across Africa in terms of corporate governance. I don't want to go into defining corporate governance. I'm using these challenges so that we picture what we need to do regarding corporate governance. Okay? It's easy to say that there's nothing wrong with this picture because it has nothing to do with capital markets. But from a development of capital markets point of view, as we are saying, the entities over which these chairpersons preside are the ones that ought to come and raise long-term debt for utilities, long-term debt for infrastructure. But because of the nature of the poor corporate governance, they sometimes fail to do that. Equities. The challenge with equities, as I said earlier on, is that many a business person that could benefit from equities on the capital markets do not have the appreciation of the value of capital markets in their business. From a corporate governance point of view, African businesses are by and large an extension of the household. And if they're an extension of the household, they also then do not accept to be subjected to other people giving them input or advice on how they should run their business. And it's a huge challenge because we have a huge chasm to cross here, to go from entities that are primarily household-based, that are an extension of the household, to corporatized entities which would have properly functional structures like a board, executive management, and shareholders and other stakeholders and employees. There are also other structures that we can talk to that have challenges with corporate governance in capital markets. But allow me to finish off this slide looking at brokers, advisors, and other intermediaries. I think what we ought to appreciate is that for Africa, and probably true of other continents, we're seeing slides of Korea and markets like that. Capital markets form a very important access point for investors into African economies. Goldman Sachs, in their report, I'm afraid this is not RMB, but Goldman Sachs, in their report of 2013, entitled Africa's Growth Story, Emerging Frontier Market Economies, they decried the poor state of development of African stock markets as access points into these economies. And I want to put it to you that part of the reason for that is the fact that corporate governance is not what it should be in these markets themselves. We can go through the list of what corporate governance, good, sound corporate governance should be, and the Botswana Stock Exchange has a code for corporate governance. But I get the impression that this is for the businesses that come to the market, for the listed companies or listed issuers, not necessarily for the Botswana Stock Exchange itself. That's the impression that I get. I may obviously be wrong. That's true of most of the capital markets out there on the continent. They say charity begins at home. So I'd want to put it out that we need sound, good corporate governance within the markets themselves, within the infrastructure of capital markets themselves, before we want issuers to adhere to this corporate governance. It is a tragedy that across the continent, a good number of markets are still run on the basis of small clubs. A club of a number of individuals who decide how they actually carry out their business. Very much the story we're hearing about how family businesses are run before they come to the market. And corporatizing initiatives, corporatization moves have by and large been resisted or deliberately slowed by these exchanges. We need to flip that. We need to change that if we are going to access particularly some of the capital we're looking at, like the foreign investments. Specifically, brokers and advisors, in some instances, can have issues of conflict of interest which get glossed over. When a regulator like Ra Ramasedi comes along and says, you are infringing here, you need to adhere to this and this, they club together, because they're a club, and they parry him off. Those challenges slow down development of capital markets on the continent and certainly don't open them up to foreign investors. So what should be the way forward? Way forward and recommendations. The OECD says good corporate governance is not an end in itself. It is a means to create market confidence and business integrity, which in turn is essential for companies that need access to long-term equity or debt for long-term investment. Emphasis there, mine. Now, from this point, we do appreciate that without good corporate governance, the markets fall short of creating confidence that will bring both issuers and investors into the market. And without this confidence, few, if any, will want to participate in these markets. Without this confidence, the intermediary role of capital markets between capital inflow and capital deployment is completely undermined. But there's some hope. There's some hope in the sense that stock exchanges or stock markets, as front-run regulators, can establish and enforce requirements that promote good corporate governance of those issuers that happen to list, but can also ensure impartial and non-subjective enforcement. But we need to ensure that corporate governance challenges, as I've said, are addressed across the entire ecosystem, and in particular going forward, that we embrace the 6 OECD principles of good corporate governance. It is very easy to argue, when you look at that belongs to the developed markets, developed economies of the OECD countries. But the story of Lee Kuan Yew about Singapore from third world to first is that he first sought to establish in Singapore an environment that would make a potential investor from developed economies feel at home within Singapore before the investor would come. I put it to you that the same is the case that we need for African capital markets. We need to establish standards that are comparable, if not better, than what is obtaining in developed markets, and then the investors from out there will be flocking into these markets. I just want to point out the last point there of the 6 OECD principles, clearly articulated responsibilities of the board. Given time, we would have gone into that for the purposes of this discussion, but we don't have time, except to say that I already pointed out the challenges we have with chairpersons of some of these boards. I said I'd quickly make a short commentary on this. Just the last point. Sustainability is looked at many different angles. One of the emphasis at the moment is sustainability reporting. But in terms of conduct of business, they are going beyond CSI, corporate social investment, beyond environment, social, and governance to shared value. Like I said, that's a whole different subject for another time. But let me end there. Thank you very much.